In Brussels, I found a number of people who were supervising the institutions where Jewish children were cared for. Many of them were orphan asylums there. One of them was a young, very attractive Belgian girl who was an educator, a teacher of early childhood, but in the period of the Nazi regime felt called upon to dedicate her life to helping the victims. She had been instrumental in saving a number of Jewish children who she brought into orphan homes. She worked within the orphan home and worked on the outside as well. Mm-hmm. And at my farewell from Namur, I went on up to Antwerp and came home just in the very end of December in 1945, and it was released in the beginning of January 1946. But they had a farewell dinner for me at which they had a number of the various groups that I had been working with. It was a very moving and memorable experience. Jean Deman is in this country now. She is married to a professor in California someplace, but for a number of years...
Do you remember the name?
I can't remember it really, I'm sorry. For a number of years she was on the speakers list of the UJA and traveled all over the country doing fairly effective work in fundraising for the UJA because of her background. And perhaps I could just conclude this, since we're almost up to the point where I left Europe and returned. I might say that after my return I was asked to make a statement which was given before the Congressional Commission on the motivation of the Jews whom I found in Europe as to whether they of the surviving Jews, whether they really wanted to go to Israel or whether this was merely propaganda. We were trying to get the commitment to enable them to open the doors to Israel, and Rabbi Phil Bernstein, who was then the head of the Armed Services Commission of the JWB, had asked me to make the statement, and that statement was incorporated, I believe, into the congressional record, together with statements of a number of other people who had had contact with survivors. But perhaps this story is a fitting story to complete this tale. We had taken over an unused building in the outskirts of Namur as a kind of headquarters for the people. There were these who were in the home of the Vicar André, and there were others who were living at various other places. By this time, some had got private apartments. One was a man by the name of Burak, B-U-R-A-K, who was an attorney from Brussels, I believe, but who was the elected leader, president of the group. There were other people who were in the diamond industry in Antwerp and others. At any rate, we took this over and outfitted it so it could be used as a meeting place for them. At each day, I would come down and bring again a supply of food down there, pots of leftover soup and vegetables and other things that they would have. And one day during this period, I got from Dachau, from Rabbi Klausner, who was then working in Dachau, the first list of survivors. When he got there, he compiled the list. It was a mimeograph list in rough alphabetical order, not completely so, but it was many mimeograph pages listing the names of the survivors. And the minute I got it, I drove down in my Jeep to the headquarters, this little room that we had set up as our headquarters. There were always a dozen or so of them just milling around talking. There was nothing yet for them to do. And I brought this out. Each one, to his best knowledge, was the only surviving member of his family, but there was that terrible uncertainty what had happened to the others. And I brought this in, and they lined up immediately, each one waiting to go through all the names to see if he could see the name of somebody of his family, at least of somebody he knew. I had other duties and had to drive away. I was away for some hours and took the first opportunity I could to drive back again. And I'll never forget, I came around the corner. There was one of the group who was a little older than the others. They called him Zeta because he's a little older than the others. Not particularly a leader. He was a nice, simple guy, and he was waiting for me. He heard the Jeep, and he came out of the door and came running towards me, yelling, "Chaplain, I found my brother! I found my brother!" And I sort of feel that that's what this whole story is about, that the time should come when no Jew has to be without a brother, and that we all stand side by side.
Fine. Now, there are a couple of questions that I have.
Yeah.
You weren't involved in any way with the JDC?
Not directly.
They hadn't come at that point?
No. They had come in, were just beginning to come in as I was leaving.
Now, what was the Army's reaction to your activities? Well, obviously you were taking some food.
I was taking food, I was taking equipment, I was taking material which had been sent over, which is in the supplies for American GIs. My own feeling was that none of us were American soldiers were deprived. There was a great deal of surplus equipment. For example, people who paid the expenses of the war don't realize sometimes how wasteful war can be. We would send out a group of people to the combat front lines, to the line. We would load them on a bus and give them a lot of stuff, jackets, during the winter, the logements, warm jackets and so on. Time after time, the bus got going, these kids would throw that stuff off the sides because they knew that once you got to the combat line, there would also be a supply office, and all supplies are expendable without giving account for them. And you come up there, so why schlep it along with them when up there they could get another one? So that knowing the fact that no American soldiers were being deprived, that there would be enough for their needs, I felt no moral compunction in taking the material and turning it over there. On the part of the people whom I knew, in some cases Jewish men in various quartermaster and other departments, I found good cooperation. And occasionally when there was no Jew, a non-Jew, after I would explain what I was doing, would be glad to cooperate. In some cases there was a reluctance, let's say, when I needed buses to take the fellows, the youngsters from Namur up to Brussels. I had to go through, suddenly they posed difficulties. I had to go to our commanding officer and get official permission to take these buses. It meant really 2 truck buses that were used to transport army men.
Who was your commanding general?
His name escapes me at this moment, and I'm ashamed that it does, but it will come back to me after we finish our interview. But probably I can just picture him, but I can't remember his name. So he was a commanding general of our second replacement depot at the time.
So basically what you're saying is that the Army was pretty receptive to...
They were pretty receptive, excepting in individual cases where there was an innate anti-Semitism, which you find among certain non-Jews, and secondly, on the part of certain people who were, let me say, overly GI in their attitude, and felt that no matter how worthy the cause, you had to go through channels and get official permission. They felt that the use of these big truck buses was too obvious there and might be challenged if somebody said, how come they're carrying civilians in these buses, and therefore felt that if I had an official authorization, it would be safer.
Were you involved in any way with the Jewish agency?
No. The only kind of contact that I had with Israel was through accidental contacts. When I was in Italy, there were units of the Jewish, now the separate Jewish brigade had not yet been organized, but there were separate Jewish units, Palestinian units of the British Army, and they were one of them was located very near me, one some distance from me, but I took occasion to visit them. In most cases, they were transportation units, water carriers, other units of that kind, and I did take the opportunity of visiting with them. Up at the end, when I was in Namur in Brussels, there were a couple of centers. I forget what they called them, similar to Red Cross centers. There were recreation centers where soldiers could come, and there was one, whether it was designed that way or not, that was frequented virtually entirely by Israelis, then Palestinian, Jewish Palestinians. And I came there, and they informed me of their work, and while I was working with some of these groups, the Jewish groups from Israel started to come into the area and was beginning to work, and I know that they had both personnel and equipment, trucks and so on that they were using, and were beginning to find little groups and take them out.
But they never asked your...
No, I didn't. We told them about what we were doing. I gave them information about where certain groups that I knew of were located, but we didn't work together.
Mm-hmm. What about UNRWA? Were you involved with UNRWA at all?
No.
Okay. With Aliyah Bet in any way?
No, excepting in the sense that I was aware of what was going on, and occasionally would meet chaplains who were involved, who were going to be involved in this kind of thing.
Were you ever called upon to smooth the relations between the survivors of the Holocaust and the United States Army?
Never called upon to do so, but I took it upon myself wherever I came. I had fairly good relationships with the commanding group within the units where I was, and aside from this solicited interview with General Clay in my own unit, I kept them prepared so that insofar as our organization was concerned, there would be a positive attitude towards the need of serving the survivors.
Now, you had no involvement at all with concentration camps? Other than...
Only in the fact that being in Germany as the concentration camps were first opened, I took the first opportunity that I could to get down to Dachau. And the years since, incidentally, since travel has been my avocation, I've been to a dozen travel concentration camps throughout Germany and in Austria and in Poland. But at that time, Dachau was the nearest one. I went down to Munich and then went out to Dachau and had it was difficult at the time to get in because it was just been taken over. The bodies of the survivors were still, many of them were still unburied, and they were burnt in the crematoria there at the time, but they were still not disposed of. There were people around, emaciated people, still in their concentration camp uniforms. Some of them were beginning to be released and were wandering by foot along the countryside, still in their concentration camp uniforms. And I came into the concentration camp, and both in Dachau and in a neighboring camp, the name of which I forget, right near Dachau, where there was a little more freedom of movement. Dachau was... What?
Feldafing, you talking about?
What was it?
Feldafing,
yes. I went there, and there I met with a number of the groups who told me about their experiences, and many of them who later came to my outfit in Worms, and I met with them, gave them temporary relief and funds that I had at my disposal, saw that they were outfitted with some kind of clothes and equipment and so on, and I had over several days I had a whole succession of men coming in telling me their stories. I asked them, and I recommended to them that they write it down so that while it was still fresh in their mind, they have the record of their experiences.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that you had collected guns for this group from Shomer HaTzair.
Sure.
Was there anything other than this, collecting of guns to Palestine that you did?
No.
Okay. And were you involved with the other Jewish chaplains in helping Jewish refugees?
Well, I was in touch with other people. For example, there was what's his name, was up in Frankfurt, Browdy, Chaplain Browdy.
Max Browdy.
Max Browdy, who came up to Frankfurt to serve in the 7th Army headquarters.
He was in the constabulary, right?
I don't know if he was in the
constabulary,
but he was in the headquarters of the 7th Army, and I was in communication with him. In fact, he came along with me at the time that I made my contact with the curator of the museum in Worms, who had been instrumental in saving a number of books and other objects, including the key stones remaining from the structure of the synagogue in Worms, which has since been completely rebuilt according to the original plans, utilizing the original stones, the stones of the archway, the stones of the Rashi stool, which was the wooden seat in the Rashi Kapelle, and other things. And I had made an appointment with him and went up to see Browdy, and he came down with me, and together we visited him and took over temporarily the Worms Machzer, which was later returned to the military authorities because it was museum items which we had no right to keep individually, and then it was advanced. But I worked with him and consulted with him, and there were several others whom we had worked with when I was in Namur. There was a Rabbi Goldman who was in the Air Force nearby, and one or two others. Rabbi Isaac Klein, who was in the Air Force in the same community. They had just outside the community, they had an Air Force center where he was stationed, and we talked together and worked together on some things, but primarily there was no organized cooperation.
Now, how would you characterize your role as a chaplain during this period you were in the Army?
Yeah. Well, let me say that as a chaplain, my primary responsibility was to the men in the American Army whom I was serving, and to the best of my ability, I did a reasonably good job, I think, in serving them, both in terms of Jewishness, conducting services, carrying on educational programs, giving them a sense of pride and dignity in being Jewish. And I still meet men all over the country who remind me of those days, being a replacement depot with a constant turnover of men who would stay with us sometimes for several weeks, sometimes for several months. Our cadre, that is the people who were with us permanently, was relatively limited. Most of the men I served continued to turn over, and I feel that I gave them a deep Jewish experience during their time, beyond what they might have received certainly at home. Mm-hmm. And I also shared with them the concerns about our relationships with Jewish survivors, so that many of them did volunteer assistance in helping me do the limited work that I did, and that too, I think, was a positive aspect of my work. Beyond that, I was first of all a chaplain in the American Army. Beyond that, I am a Jew with responsibilities to the Jewish people. This has been a central thesis of my philosophy of Jewish life all through my rabbinical career, and there it was in sharp focus. Wherever I came, where there were Jews, I made contact with the Jews, with whatever organized Jewish communal life there might still be, or with individual Jews, and whatever I could, I tried to do, feeling that my being a chaplain did not deny my essential responsibility to the Jewish people.
What do you think would have happened, excuse me, if chaplains like yourself had not been there at that time with regards to helping the remnants of European Jewry?
I imagine that eventually most of those who were saved would have been saved. I think it was really the Israeli, I use the word Israeli even though Israel as a state had not yet been established, but the Israeli influence and work, and they did magnificent work during that time, which was the instrumentality of saving them, the whole Aliyah Beit, the whole organization. These men came out, many of them came out of British Army installations. They did so by all sorts of devices to get themselves free when they were supposed to be on duty, and to have them accounted for in roll calls when they were out working on other projects. They would tell me about these things, and it was unbelievable, because, you know, it was like one of these spy stories that you read where all kinds of things were done. But they really did the work. Where did we come in? We came in the sense that we were, in many cases, the first on the scene. And morally, psychologically, it meant a great deal to these people to realize suddenly that they were not alone. During all the years of the occupation, there was virtually no contact with the outside world. Those who were really suffering had the hope that their fate was known, that people were concerned, but there was no evidence, or only on rare occasions was there evidence of it. We were able to bring them the feeling of the unity of the Jewish people, and to them, from a psychological point of view, it was a tremendously important thing. All the time that they had been under the Nazi yoke, things were bad enough. But when the Nazis were defeated, the great day had come for which they had dreamed, and there was little change. They may have come out of the concentration camp. Some cases are still in the camp, but those who ventured out of the concentration camp found some sort of temporary housing in abandoned hotels and whatnot. But they still were going around on lines, not knowing what to do. Nobody in, and they had thought that the day of the conquest of the Nazis would be a great hallelujah day, you know. And so our presence there was a reassuring thing, and we could tell them, just have a little patience. And so that would be the one thing, the psychological value of having somebody representing the larger Jewish world, and somebody who was, let me say, obviously, externally, unashamedly Jewish. Or the chaplain was the only person. You met other Jewish soldiers, but the chaplain wore the mark of his Jewishness on his uniform and the chaplain's insignia. And this they marveled over, to see the commandments surmounted by the Star of David there. And on the most chaplains, it wasn't required, but most of us on our chaplains' jeeps put big Jewish stars and other symbols indicating the fact that we were Jewish. That meant a great deal. The second is the relief. Now, other men may have been in a position to do more, to work directly on Aliyah Beit. Mine was limited. It was just bringing supplies, some of which were desperately needed, some of which may not have been needed, but which brought them, let me say, some kind of monetary support if they could dispose of them. But these supplies, in Namur, they were being fed not too adequately by the Catholic community. I took that over for them. They preferred being fed by Jews rather than by non-Jews. And so I brought them a limited measure of material support during that period. And that was of some value. And our chief function, as I see it for myself and some others like me, was in making more bearable the interim period between the liberation and the time when the Jewish organized world community was able to take over and promote both the relief of those in need and the Aliyah Beit for those who were going to Israel.
I think you summed it up very well. But is there any other area that I may not have touched on that you feel that should be discussed?
No, and so far as my experience is concerned, I've tried to present to you as complete the picture. There were limitations to what I could do because of where I was and what I had to work with. I was, in a sense, while in the areas, I was on the fringe. There were others who were directly involved, and I believe Rabbi Abe Hazelcorn. I don't know if you had a chance to speak to him. He's on the West Coast. was involved in Aliyah Beit, several others who would talk to me about it, working directly. The important thing was, I think, that each of us, with the fewest of exceptions, as chaplains in the American Armed Forces, responded to the needs of the circumstances in which we found ourselves and did what could be done. And that, to me, is perhaps the tribute that could be paid to the chaplains, that where they were, they didn't shirk or turn from doing something. Some were not in a position to do anything. They were in other areas. Some were directly in the areas where they could work on the guts issues of getting these people out and bringing them to Israel. I was in an intermediary position where I could help them, tide them over, and in a few cases, as I did in more, bring them to the start of their pilgrimage, which was to end in Israel. But I believe that that's about all that I can give you. There are other details of the experiences which I know I've omitted, which if I could actually have taken the time to go through the letters I wrote to my wife and other things, might have enriched some of the stories, but that would be merely detail. The essential picture of what I did in the various communities where I was should be clear.
Fine. Thank you very much.
You're certainly welcome.